with Trump coming in, I think that we've got a moment where we all have to understand that it will be a very different United States. It will therefore have a big play in the way that we think about things. And I think one of the things that Sir Richard was saying in his speech is, the intelligence community is getting this. It's really on top of it. It really understands the range of threats. And in a way, it was a message to Russia, it was a message to Iran and to other countries that might be thinking of sowing more and more the seeds of discord within European countries.
The head of MI6 says he's never seen the world in a more dangerous state. He's warned Russia would not stop if it wins Ukraine. Sir Richard Moore has also warned of the potential for terrorism across Europe in the wake of the conflict in the Middle East. Well, Dr Patricia Lewis is the director of the International Security Programme at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, better known perhaps as Chatham House. Patricia, I wonder what you make of what Sir Richard Moore has said. Is he right?
Yes, I think he is. I mean, I think it's been well known for a while now that, Ukraine is the front line. And Russia, if we don't stop Russia there, or Ukraine doesn't manage to prevail in some way, that we will be in a much worse situation going forward. We'll have an emboldened Putin, we'll have an emboldened Russia. China will look at this and think that the West doesn't have the capability to support even Ukraine. And we're all, just a facade, and we're being big trouble going forward.
You talk about Russia prevailing. I wonder what you make of what Zelenskyy has said in the last 24 hours. Quite a dramatic shift, I think, in his thinking. Perhaps he's just being realistic about the fact that the Trump administration is incoming, things will change, and that the new Lieutenant General, General Kellogg, Kevin Kellogg, who is in charge from Trump's perspective, will be suing for peace in some sense in Ukraine. I wonder what you make of those developments.
Yes, I mean, this idea has been around for a while. The idea is to have a sort of ceasefire that would be very carefully monitored, that would be in place for probably quite a long time, possibly leading to a bigger peace deal, in which you'd have a situation not dissimilar, perhaps, at the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War of East and West Germany, where you had West Germany guaranteed by NATO, and East Germany, of course, under the sphere of influence of Russia. What we don't want, of course, is another wall like the Berlin Wall. But I think for a temporary situation, this may be the best possibility for Ukraine right now. The problem that we have with it, of course, is how do you guarantee Western Ukraine? Because NATO is not yet ready to accept Ukraine into NATO. And there's a lot of controversy about it within NATO, and it will take time. So what sort of guarantee? Would it be a guarantee from the United States? Would it be a guarantee from a subset of NATO countries? I think all of these things we have to think about. And how would you monitor it? How would you make sure that Russia, that has broken so many of its agreements over the issue of Ukraine, would actually stick to those terms?
I wonder if we could talk about terrorism more generally, and specifically the threats, I suppose, to the United Kingdom. What is the split, do you think, between threats from the far right versus Islamism versus any other forms of terrorism?
Well, I mean, they're not disconnected, right? So obviously, we're going to have a rise in terrorism from what's been happening in the Middle East. I think everyone understands that, there'll be a generation of very traumatized young people, and some of those will want vengeance. Some of them will take to terror on the streets. They may well be, of course, supported by Iran and Russia in that effort. And then, of course, we have the right wing rise, partly as a backlash and preying on people's fears, and just taking on the same sort of tactics and causing mayhem. Again, Russia is very keen on this because it seeds all sorts of chaos. China, not so much, I would say, because China wants a little bit of chaos in the world, enough to maneuver its way through and become more of an important player. But it doesn't want complete chaos. And it certainly doesn't want madness in Europe and European economies to be affected because of the importance of the European economy to the Chinese economy. The same for the United States. So with Trump coming in, I think that we've got a moment where we all have to understand that it will be a very different United States. It will therefore have a big play in the way that we think about things. And I think one of the things that Sir Richard was saying in his speech is, the intelligence community is getting this. It's really on top of it. It really understands the range of threats. And in a way, it was a message to Russia, it was a message to Iran and to other countries that might be thinking of sowing more and more the seeds of discord within European countries.
Well, we'll start with Ukraine and what Zelenskyy has been saying over the last few days. Speaking to Sky News, he said Ukrainian territory could be put under the NATO umbrella so that a more diplomatic solution is reached. This is a really interesting one. I think it's a real softening of his line. I wonder what you make of it, Gitu.
I think it is a softening because what he's been holding out for is full membership of NATO. And some critics say that it was that desire to join NATO that was one of the excuses, I guess, that Putin seized upon, unfairly, of course, to attack. But there is a subtle but important change there. If Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and I think he is open to the idea that Ukraine does not have to be within NATO, a member of NATO, but have the kind of security guarantees perhaps from NATO, and that would give him the confidence to cut a deal with Russia, then it does look as if there's a small, narrow landing spot now where there could be a deal done, I think, in the new year to end the war.
Do you think this is workable, Alison, especially when you think about it? I mean, it may not be full NATO membership. It may be a rump of Ukraine rather than the whole country as defined by international borders. The occupied bits that Russia has, the Donbass, for example, may not be member of it. But do you think this is a workable solution, especially when you've got the fact that all 32 NATO countries would need to agree to it?
I don't think it's a workable solution in its current form. I mean, as Guto so rightly said there, the reason that a lot of this situation first arose was because of Putin's concerns around NATO and Ukraine's desire to be part of NATO. And of course, on the other hand, you've got, would NATO even want really to extend membership to Ukraine on the understanding that if there was then any further movement forwards from Russia,
a huge risk, isn't it?
All of NATO getting involved. So would anybody actually even want to go down that route? However, what I do think it is it's now less than 2 months until President Trump is inaugurated. And at that point, the real deal making is going to become. And I think what this is from Zelenskyy is a kind of an opening gambit. It's quite interesting. I think in that interview, he said that he very much wanted to be dealing with President Trump direct. And I think he probably does think, right, here's a guy that's going to come in. He has already committed to trying to achieve a deal. He wants to be part of that negotiations rather than kind of getting sidelined out of those negotiations. So here's his opening gambit. And the other thing you've got to remember as well is Zelenskyy's popularity is lessening within Ukraine. People are very war weary, as you completely can understand. And he's going to have to start looking for some pragmatic solutions, however painful some of those may appear.
Some would argue as well that actually his negotiating position was a lot stronger perhaps a year ago. So do you think the time has come to sue for peace?
I think, he's reading the room like everybody else. Donald Trump has been quite blatant about, not wanting to support an ongoing war. And though initially that was something that a lot of people found frustrating, I think now the war weariness must be, it's been horrific, and it's horrific, day by day at the moment. So without any progress being made on either side. So I think the time is right like that, and there are creative solutions being talked about, as I understand it, quietly, so that I think the Crimea, basically, annoying though it is for Zelenskyy, that was lost and conceded and largely consolidated by the international community's view of the whole deal a decade ago. So then you look at the Donbass, and what you might be looking at there is a kind of, like the peace deal, the Good Friday Agreement we had in Northern Ireland, where one piece of land can actually be owned by one but relate to the other. There'll be something creative there. But the key thing that they really are going around in circles about is, what does a security guarantee look like for Zelenskyy and for Ukraine after all this pain, unless it involves membership in NATO? I think quietly they know they're not going to be a member of NATO. So how can they feel that when they cut a deal, they are not leaving themselves vulnerable to another attack like this? They're perfectly entitled. Indeed, they need to sort of insist on that being rock solid. What does that look like? What can Trump offer on that? that will give them the reassurance they need to cut a deal.
And that's a fair point, Alison, isn't it? Because NATO is not homogenous by any stretch of the imagination. You've got nations like Hungary, for example, that may think very, very differently from the United Kingdom. Germany has acted in a very different way as well. And it's a huge risk if there were a security guarantee to be given to Ukraine. Some nations within NATO are essentially giving that security guarantee themselves, some would argue, at the moment, in a way. Whereas for the entire body to give that security guarantee to Ukraine, however that would manifest itself, I mean, that's a big risk, isn't it? That's a big commitment, especially with the volatility of Russia.
It is a big commitment to the point where I can't see that it's a commitment that's going to come to pass, in all honesty. I mean, you've got to remember as well that in this country, we're very used to this line of that, we've got to be side by side with Ukraine. We should be defending them. We are quite a long way advanced of what a lot of other people within both Europe and both NATO feel on that point. And, there's lots of other people who feel that Ukraine should have been sort of trying to move somewhere towards peace some time ago. So regardless of what we here may think about that, the reality is I can't see a way in which you would get the current NATO to give some kind of guarantee like this. However, as Guto says, this could be the beginning of trying to find some way of creating greater security for what remains of Ukraine after a deal is done.
I wonder, Guto, what you make of what Sir Richard Moore has been saying, the current head, I should say, of MI6. You will have encountered him, of course, on your travels in Downing Street. He says, in 37 years in the intelligence profession, I've never seen the world in a more dangerous state. He was in Paris with Nicolas Lerner, who's the head of the French Foreign Intelligence Agency, the DGSE. And he said that Nicolas and I are in no doubt about the stakes in Ukraine. If Putin is allowed to succeed in reducing Ukraine to a vassal state, he will not stop there.
And he's spot on, of course, and the world is an extremely dangerous place. But one of the things I do to comfort myself, that if there is a deal and essentially Ukraine, after all this pain, is back where it essentially was, having lost the Crimea a decade ago, I comfort myself that is not a sort of war that was fought in vain, because the agenda for Putin was the total invasion and abolition, essentially, of Ukraine as a sovereign, independent, democratic nation. And I was in briefings in Number 10 and elsewhere where, very, very clever people were predicting that Kyiv would fall in 3 days and Ukraine would fall in 3 weeks. So the fact that he's still standing 2 years on and in a position to cut a deal that, yes, will be painful, but B, with the right security guarantees that Ukraine remains a sovereign, independent nation, missing, a couple of bits of it, significant, painful though it is, that is not a bad outcome.
Alison, what do you think the outcome will be in a few months' time when we look back at this? I mean, we've had President Trump saying in 24 hours as president he's going to solve this. I'd be surprised if that happens, but we're certainly seeing the movement in the direction of what he wants to happen and perhaps Zelensky's reaction to that. I just wonder what your sort of, not prediction necessarily, but what you're feeling things might look like perhaps 6 months, a year from now in Ukraine. Can you see a peaceful Ukraine, a happy Ukraine, a safe Ukraine?
I don't think there will ever be happiness. Well, I think it's going to take a long time because that concern that Putin's going to come back will remain. But I think, obviously, Trump seems very keen on this idea of creating some demilitarized zone, which would run across the areas, pretty much the areas that have been taken by Russia up until this point, because the additional territory which we know Ukraine took from Russia earlier in the year, they are really struggling to hold on to that now. They are really struggling to get the manpower they required onto the front line. They're having to bring down the age of conscription. So they are really, really struggling there. And I know there's been sort of certain pockets of what you might say positivity in that they had the green light to use the Storm Shadow. But the overall picture for Ukraine is looking increasingly challenged. And so I think we are going to probably see a carving up within the next year. And there will have to be sort of an acceptance that at this stage, in a very, very long process, but at this stage, there will be bits of the Ukraine that stay with Russia. And that, I think Zelenskyy said that maybe those places could be get back by diplomatic means at some later date. I very much doubt that whilst Putin's in charge. And I think obviously there is that very real chance that Putin will continue to wish to move forward. But it's definitely caused him grounds for thought, as Guto says. I mean, at the beginning of this war, we thought he was going to be charging right way through Ukraine and perhaps onwards from there. But this has reshaped things for Russia as well.